Welcome everyone to our lecture this evening. We're very privileged to have Dr. Benedek Péri from Utrecht University in Budapest, as you've heard. And I know the title was very exciting for me because I mean, you stick, poetry and drugs in the Ottoman Empire. I'm like, I don't know about anyone else, but I heard that title and thought I want to hear more. So very much looking forward to this. Dr. Péri is a graduate of Utrecht Lorand, graduating from Turkish, Iranian Studies and English departments with diplomas in 92 and 95. He researches the history of classical Turkic literary traditions, the history of Turkic literacy on the Indian subcontinent, and the history of Turkic-Persian literary relations, and more to the point for this evening, the history of drug use in the Turkic cosmopolis. So he is a prolific conference attendee, so hopefully we all get the chance to bump into him at one point or another. He's often an invited speaker, so we're very lucky to have secured his presence here tonight. And yeah, he does lots of work on Hungarian-Uzbek relations, and has won awards for that. And he is just well known right across, international academic committee in his field. So I will hand over to you in a moment. I will say we will have time for questions and answers after. If you do have a question, or if you think of it as the talk progresses and you don't want to save it to the end to forget it, you can write it into the chat. If you put question in capital letters ahead of it, and I'll just put an example in the chat right now, then when we get to the Q&A, I will go back through those questions and invite people to ask their questions, because I think that's quite a good way of doing it. So without much further ado, you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear Dr. Péri. So over to you, our speaker.
Thank you, Gemma, for your flattering words. I welcome you all this evening. Before I start my presentation, I kindly request you to spare a moment to remember those people who lost their lives during this earthquake in Turkey, and also remember to people who are desperately waiting for help under the rubble. Okay, and now let's come to the topic of poetry and drugs in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th, 17th century. First of all, I think I owe you an explanation how I became interested in this topic. It started with lectures I was given to my students on various genres in classical poetry. And I wanted them to read a short masnavi, a short narrative poem. And my choice was Mohammed Fuzuli's Bengübade, Weed and Wine, the debate of weed and wine. And first, of course, I had to read the text. I wanted to understand it. And I was sure that it was full of allusions to contemporary drug subculture. So I started doing research on the topic, and that's how I became interested in researching drug culture in the Ottoman Empire. Now I'll try to share my screen. Yeah. Can you see it now? Yes. Okay, I'll try to start. Can you see the slides moving? Fine. Okay. So, intoxicating, inebriating, narcotic or visionary qualities of plants have been known to mankind from time immemorial. Some of the plants have been appreciated solely for their invigorating or intoxicating effects, but others have served less mundane purposes and have much been used as medicines or entheogens. Entheogens are psychoactive substances that induce alterations in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, or behavior for the purposes of engendering spiritual development or otherwise in sacred context. The good examples for entheogens are sacred mushrooms from the Americas, or the Amanita muscaria from Siberia, where shamans used it. Hemp is a dioecious plant with a wide area of distribution, and it's well known for its psychoactive qualities in many traditional cultures and religions. It is thought to have originated from Central Asia, from a vast geographical area extending from the Caspian Sea to the Altai Mountains, the Himalayan borderlands, and North China, where it still grows wild. According to a widespread Islamic legend, first related by al-Ukbari, who passed away in the late 13th century, and later retold by many Muslim authors, the intoxicating effects of the hemp plant were discovered by a dervish of Turkish origin, Qutbuddin Haydar, who passed away approximately around 1221-23, and who became the founder of an antinomian spiritual community in the late 12th century. The ultimate source of the story was a member of the Haydari community, a certain Ja'far bin Muhammad al-Shirazi, who claimed that he had been a witness to the following extraordinary events. Qutbuddin Haydar, as the story goes, was living in a hermitage he had founded at a remote place in the hills in the vicinity of Nishapur in eastern Iran. Though a large number of disciples gathered around him, he lived in seclusion. He often disappeared for days, submerged in spiritual exercises and devotion. On an extremely hot summer day, however, the unusual heat forced him to leave the hermitage in order to breathe some fresh air. As he stood in front of the building and tried to get some relief, he noticed the plant. Unlike other shrubs and trees that stood still in the unmoving air, it was swinging and swaying to and fro as if it was dancing. He became curious and tasted it. As soon as he chewed one of its leaves, he felt a sort of unearthly bliss. He felt free from earthly concerns, and he was happy as he had never been before. He shared his findings with his companions, who tasted the leaves as well, and they also experienced its unusual effects. Haydar ordered them to divulge it only to dervishes, who are also treading the path of spiritual quest. The story, however fictitious it may seem, tells us a lot on how and when hemp as a hallucinogenic substance became known to the Islamic world. The legend connecting the discovery of the mind-altering properties of wild hemp to Haydar makes 3 points clear. First, cannabis was not customarily used as a psychoactive substance by Muslims before his times. Second, the introduction of this practice has something to do with the religious movement he belonged to, or with the community he is said to have founded. And third, cannabis entered the Muslim cultural area from an eastern direction. Muslim sources confirm that the use of cannabis was originally unknown in the central Islamic lands. Baki, who passed away in 1600, a celebrated Ottoman poet and an acknowledged authority on the religious law in the 16th century, devotes a few paragraphs in his Ma'alimul Yaqeen to the legal status of cannabis consumption, and claims that cannabis was unknown during the time of the founders of the 4 major Islamic schools of jurisprudence. The custom, he adds, appeared in the end of the 7th century after the Hijrah, that is somewhat later than the date suggested by the legend. Here you can see the Turkish text of Baki's description. The legal opinions Baki cites in his book clearly showed that there were no authoritative religious texts available concerning cannabis on which a fatwa could have been based. This indicates that during the formative period of the Islamic legal system, cannabis was either not known at all in Islamic culture, or its use was still not widespread. By the 15th century, the situation had considerably changed, and religious authorities were forced to provide legally justifiable answers to questions pertaining to cannabis consumption. When Ottoman legal experts were asked to produce their views on the subject in the 16th century, they resorted to a method invented by earlier Arabic jurists by treating cannabis as one of the mind-altering substances, muskirat. In order to describe cannabis intoxication, Ottoman jurists often applied the word sakr, the legal term that was also used to denote drunkenness. Nevertheless, while Ottomans forbade the consumption of alcoholic beverages in every circumstances, hallucinogenic substances like cannabis and opium were considered permissible if they were not taken for pleasure or they didn't cause intoxication. The analogy of alcohol, especially wine and cannabis intoxication, coupled with Haidar's legendary role in the discovery of the plant's special properties, had become heavily imprinted into Islamic public opinion by the 15th century, as a phrase Al-Makrizi uses for cannabis illustrates it quite well, the wine of Haidar. Coming back to the text relating how the hallucinogenic properties of cannabis were discovered, the story seems to be a good example of etiological tales, a type of narrative that tries to explain why certain phenomena are the way they are. But unlike other pourquoi stories that are mere imaginary tales, this legend might have some historical truth in it. Qutbuddin Haidar and his followers belonged to a much wider religious current, generally termed Kalandariya. Though various groups belonging to the spiritual movement might have had different symbols, they shared a common worldview with heavy tendencies toward asceticism and antinomianism. Their system of weird-looking customs and rituals that included conscious and purposeful violation of religious prescriptions and taboos served to free adherents from all worldly attachments. Our contemporary Orthodox Muslim sources that usually speak of calendars in a heavily reprehensive tone doesn't provide us with a systematic description of calendary practices. Nevertheless, they seem to agree that some of these groups of ascetics not only avoided the daily 5 prayers and violated the rules of fasting, they also made various intoxicating preparations from cannabis. For what purpose did dervishes consume cannabis? Contemporary authors do not state. But the following lines from a poem written by Kaygusus Abdal, who passed away in 1444, a Turkish calendar in Anatolia, supplies us with a clue. Esrarı gördüm bugün binmiş gider bir ata, şöyle kim derviş olmuş herkes söylemez hata. Hızır donudur donu, hakka doğrudur yönü, şöyle cuş eyler beni erişince gizli tar. And you can see the English translation there. I won't read it out just to save some time. Hızır, the green one, whose name you can see in the English translation and also in the Turkish original. So Hızır, the green one, is a key personality in Islamic mystical lore. He's a friend of God, a saint, who is venerated by Sufis not only for finding the water of life, the Abi Hayat. Here you can see in this painting, Alexander the Great dressed in red and Hızır dressed in green, as his name shows. They are looking for the water of life in the country of darkness. That's why Hızır is holding a torch in his hand. So he is well known not only for finding the water of life in the realm of total darkness, but more importantly, for disseminating rationally incomprehensible and unobtainable esoteric knowledge, ilmi ladun. Sufi narratives often refer to him as a source for inspiration and insight, and he is also mentioned in the Quran as a guide who initiated Moses into the universe of Gnostic knowledge. By placing cannabis metaphorically on an equal standing with Khizr, Qaybusus Abdal suggests that if one takes cannabis for his guide in his spiritual quest, he can surely get a glimpse of the universal truth, that is God. This view might have been widespread among antinomian calendar groups as a blasphemous tale preserved in the Dabistani Mazahib, a 17th century work written by an unknown writer of Sipasi or Azadi Parsi affiliation on the religious communities of India illustrates it very well. Quote, they relate that one day the Prophet was taking a pleasure walk under the guidance of Jabril and came to a place where a great tumult was heard. Jabril said, "This is the threshold of pleasure, enter into the house." The Prophet consented to go in, and there he saw sitting 40 persons as naked as they come from their mother, and a band busy serving. But whatever service the Prophet requested them to command him to do, they didn't comply, until the time to grind bhang arrived. Bhang is a Persian word for cannabis, or a sort of cannabis preparation when cannabis is cooked in water or in milk. So when they had ground it, they had no cloth through which they could strain and purify it. Then the Prophet, having taken his turban from his head, purified through it the juice of the bhang, the color of which remained on the turban. Whence the turban of the Bini Hashem, means the family of the Prophet, is green. When the Prophet rendered them this service, they were glad and said among themselves, "Let us give to this messenger of God, who is always running to the door of the ignorant, a little of the bhang, that he may obtain the secrets of the Almighty power." So they gave the remains of the juice to the Prophet. When he drank it, he became possessed of the secrets of the angel of destiny, and whatever man heard from him came through the means of this bounty. End quote. This apocryphal and sacrilegious story comes from the traditional role of a religious community that was characterized by the author of the Dabistan with the following words, quote, "It is known that there is a class among the Hindus who gave themselves the term of Muslim Sufis and really agree in several tenets and opinions with the Sufis," end quote. Later in the text, it became considers Hindus are the Madaris and the Jalalis, subgroups of the Kalandari movement whose customs and outward appearance reminds him of the rituals and attire of Hindu ascetics. There has been a debate on the possible connection of antinomian dervish communities and Indian spiritual movements quite recently, while some scholars like Ahmed Kara Mustafa claim that the spiritual movement of deviant dervishes came into being as a protest movement and it was a natural answer to the institutionalization of Sufism. Others think that Kalandariya was born out of an interaction between groups of Muslim and Buddhist or Hindu mendicant ascetics. Yashar Ojak suggested that Buddhist mysticism might have also contributed to the shaping of Kalandari thinking. Harriet Hartman compared the worldview of Shaiva Hindu Kanpata yogis and Muslim Kalandar communities, both of which, according to her, had originated in the 12th century India. Athar Abbas Rizvi took the matter one step forward when he claimed that Haidaris adopted the custom of passing an iron rod through their male organs in order to indicate their determination to remain celibate from Hindu Naga sannyasis, and acquired the practice of wearing an iron earring from Kampata yogis. The possibility of Kampata yogis might have in part influenced the evolution of the system of Haidari customs take us back to the issue of spiritually motivated cannabis consumption. Founded by Goraknath in the 12th century, the Kanpata school of thought belongs to Shaivite North Tantric traditions, where cannabis and bhang, a cannabis-based drink savored by Lord Shiva, the god of Tantra, had formed an inseparable part of religious rituals already in the 7th century. On this image, you can see Shiva, Lord Shiva, and his divine consort, his wife Parvati, preparing bhang and filtering it through a handkerchief. And this intoxicating drink is part of Shiva festivals in India even today. In Shivaratri, you can consume this drink quite freely. Carved wooden panels in an 18th century Devi temple in Himachal Pradesh depicting Kanpata yogis who are preparing bhang bear witness to this. You can see that here this gentleman is using a mortar and a pestle to prepare this drink, and here this wood carving shows the same activity. Thus, it is not without reason to suggest that we should add another item to the list of customs Haidar and his followers learned from yogis. It is to rely on cannabis potential to enhance the sense of divine and thus provide its user with mystical insight and the feeling of religious ecstasy, effects that are well known to modern consumers as well. We don't know much of the early life of Qutbuddin Haidar, so we cannot tell exactly where he or his followers might have met Kanpata yogis or other Shaivite tantric communities similar to them, but according to Adhar Abbas Rizvi, Nath yogis started spreading from northern India to Central Asia and Iran in the 11th century. Here you can see several Indian ascetics, Muslims among them, preparing bhang. Here the mortar and the pestle. So the place of interaction might have taken place somewhere in Haidar's native Khorasan in eastern Iran. Cannabis use and entheogen seems to have spread from Haidaris to other Kalandari groups in Seljuk Iran and Anatolia. Just an interesting place where Hindu and Muslim mystical traditions interact is in Pakistan, in Sakhwan, at the shrine of Shahbaz Kalandar. So this interaction is still going on today. The Fustat ul-Adala fil Qawaid al-Sultana, a historical work written in Anatolia during the reign of the Seljukids, supplies us with a fairly detailed description of the customs of a spiritual community that displayed antinomian tendencies. Muhammad bin al-Khatib, the author of the work, doesn't try to hide how much he despises this group of Qalandars, whom he calls chavlakis, sackcloth wearers. He gives a long list of their detestable customs that would fill voluminous books. According to al-Khatib, chavlakis never prayed, demeaned orthodox rituals, and they sneered at anyone who followed religious prescriptions. In order to offend Orthodox Muslims, they kept dogs, an animal that is considered ritually unclean by Islamic tradition. The desecration of sacred space was a crime they very intentionally and consciously committed by taking their dogs to masjids. We cannot tell whether it was an act meant simply to shock pious Muslims or they used Muslim sacred places for their rituals as well. Nevertheless, our sources claim that these groups of dervishes prepared their cannabis-based drugs called sabzak or bangab or bang juice in English at places of worship. Chavlakis were not the only ones among Kalandari groups who consumed cannabis leaves or brewed bhang, possibly in order to facilitate their spiritual quest. As we have seen before, al-Khatib was openly hostile towards antinomian piety. So it's no wonder that he reserved a few disparaging words also on Jamaluddin Savi, who passed away in 1222, whom tradition holds to be the par excellence founder of Kalandariya as a spiritual movement. The gravest sins our author condemns Jamaluddin for is sodomy, or more exactly, illicit relationship with a young boy, and more importantly, the consumption of sabzak, or a kind of cannabis-based drug. The charges of sodomy and the use of cannabis as a pleasure-providing drug was widely circulated in Orthodox Muslim society, mainly in Iran and Ottoman Turkey, and became a commonplace element on the list of crimes outsiders ascribed to various calendar groups. These cliches solidified into public opinion and became imprinted into people's thinking so much that they were echoed by Europeans visiting Ottoman Anatolia as well. A typical account of Torlaks, a Turkish community of calendars, can be read in Nicholas de Nicolai's travelogue, giving an account of his official visit to Constantinople in 1551. Here you can see on the picture a Torlak from this book, which was first published in Italian in 1580. The English edition I quote from is a couple of years later. So, quote, they do also eat of the herb called maslach, like unto the dervish, and do sleep upon the ground, no less naked of shame than bare of clothes, using their damnable and abominable sodomitical luxury, the one with the other more beastly and unnaturally than would do the brute and wild beasts, end quote. The herb that is mentioned in this quotation, maslach, actually this word exists in Hungarian, and entered Hungarian. Its meaning is datorastramonium in Hungarian today, and it's an Ottoman Turkish loan word in modern day Hungarian that entered our language during the Ottoman occupation. Maslach was a kind of cannabis-based drug, which was cannabis powder mixed with datorastramonium. I have an article on the topic, so if you are interested, you can read it on my academia homepage. Though cannabis has officially never entered the world of institutionalized Sufism, many contemporary literary and historical sources indicate that it had become an integral part of the life of antinomian dervish communities. Anatolian Turkish texts from the 14th century confirm the connection between these dervish communities and cannabis, which they refer to the word esrar, the term used in modern Turkish as well, which is the plural of the Arabic noun sir, meaning secret. So esrar, the Turkish word used today to denote cannabis, is the plural of this Arabic word, and translated into English it would mean secrets. J.P. Brown, the author of the first Western monograph on dervish communities, claimed that the term refers to the fact that cannabis-based drugs were prepared in great secrecy. Armin Vámbéry, a Hungarian scholar who knew the world of dervishes extremely well, because disguised as an Ottoman dervish, he visited Central Asia in the 1860s, thought it otherwise, and claimed that the term refers to the alternative reality of cannabis-induced psychedelic visions. Surmising that antinomian dervish communities used cannabis as a Hizr-like guide in their spiritual quest to get initiated into the secrets of the great beyond, it's not without reason to suggest that dervishes might have been the first ones to use the word esrar to denote cannabis. If it is so, they greatly contributed to spreading the word that, as a technical term, first entered the jargon of contemporary drug subculture, and from there it was borrowed into everyday Ottoman Turkish. As we have seen, the copious data provided by various sources suggest that cannabis as an intoxicant was introduced to the Islamic world by antinomian spiritual communities, Kalandaris, Chavlakis, Haidaris, Abdas, Ishik Storlax in the late 12th century, and originally it was solely used as an entheogen in the spiritual practices of dervishes. Though later cannabis-based drugs got popular outside these communities as well, the conceptual domains of cannabis consumption and dervish life became closely connected in the Turkish world. As I have mentioned briefly, antinomy and dervish communities appeared in the Central Islamic lands in the 12th, 13th centuries, and as they became an inseparable part of the social landscape in Iran and Turkey, they made their appearance in Persian poetry as well. The romanticized picture we get from poems of Sanai Ghaznavi, Fariduddin Attar, or Hafiz is very far from the description of historical sources, which speak of them as a despicable and detestable creed who are very far from the tenets of Islam. In Kalendariyat poems, dervishes are often depicted as wandering pious rogues who dwell among ruins, drink wine, and fall in love with human beloveds. Though these practices fall outside of the boundaries of Orthodox devotion, since they are all meant to have devotees in their spiritual quest of acquiring a personal experience of God through asceticism and intoxication by love or wine, both of which are firmly set in Persian courtly culture, they were deemed acceptable as metaphors for people with mystical inclinations. Contemporary opinion of cannabis consumption was very much different, because though cannabis was used by dervishes only for spiritual purposes, it also became a cheap and easily accessible alternative of wine among the poor who couldn't afford alcohol. A couplet from Muhammad Fuzuli's Bengübade, the epic I've already mentioned, which is a short epic poem written in Masnavi form, sometime in the 1510s, documents this situation quite tellingly. In his speech, highlighting his own virtues, weed, that is cannabis, says the following: Kanda bir müflis o kalender var, benem ol müflis o kalendere yar. Let's take a poor or a calendar. I'm the companion of that poor and that calendar. Let's return briefly to the history of the term esrar, which in the meaning of cannabis never entered the works, thanks to the works of major Ottoman poets of the late 15th, early 16th century, like Hayrati, who passed away in 1557, or Hayali, who passed away in 1534, who at some point in their life treaded the dervish path themselves. The term esrar was also adopted into the vocabulary of the highly elaborate classical Ottoman poetic language. Based on the term's double meaning and its inherent poetic potential, a whole new semantic field evolved in Ottoman classical poetry around the term esrar, which I'm going to speak about briefly a bit later. Esrar, as the Turkish term par excellence for cannabis, gradually superseded the earlier used bang, both in literary and in colloquial language, sometime in the late 15th, early 16th century. Which change in the vocabulary is well illustrated by 16th, 17th centuries European works on botany and pharmacology, where Turkish equivalent for cannabis is always given as esrar. Now let's return to the Anatolian calendar's poem we have quoted earlier. The poem of Kaygusuz Abdan is not an ordinary piece of Turkish poetry, as it focuses on an unusual subject, the use of cannabis. Written by a poet personally involved in the Kalandari movement, it might be interpreted as a first-rate document, an eyewitness account of trends that prevailed in the early 15th century cannabis subculture. As it has already been mentioned, allusions to Hizr and the dervish who never tells a lie are references to the fact that dervish communities regarded cannabis not as an ordinary psychedelic drug, but as a source of spiritual inspiration. This notion is stressed at the end of the poem as well. In the last lines, Kaygusuz tells us that cannabis is a spiritual guide for him. However, he feels it important to add that only those can use it properly who are initiated into its appropriate application. Gel ey miskin kaygısız esrardan al öğütün. Bu aşıklar otudur yemez, verme her tata. Kampur kaygısız, listen to the advice of cannabis. It is the weed of lovers. Lovers means dervishes here. Don't give it to an outsider. He will not have it in a proper way. The last line is not the only clue in the poem that suggests that the intoxicating potentials inherent in cannabis made the plant known outside antinomian dervish circles as well. In a previous hemistich, Kaygusus ridicules a Sufi, who is the symbol of religious orthodoxy in the poem, for his hypocritical behavior and materialistic thinking. Sufi yemez, haram der, gizlice de görem der. Gelen yıl çok derem der, ister birazın sata. So a Sufi would say it's forbidden. He doesn't eat it openly, but secretly he says, I should try it. Next year, I'm going to collect more and sell some of it. The poets claim that Orthodox Sufis are not only very keen on getting intoxicated by cannabis, but they also harvest and sell it, implies that in the early 15th century Anatolia, cannabis was an ordinary commodity. We cannot tell when cannabis became a much sought-for drug, but an Arabic hashish poem written by Ali bin Makki suggests that it was a popular mind-altering substance in the Middle East in the early 13th century. References scattered in Persian and Turkish classical poems suggest that gradually bhang, or cannabis, also entered the world of Persianate elites of Central Asia, Iran, and Anatolia, and together with wine, it was often served as an intoxicant at feasts. The fierce competition between wine and cannabis for the attention of consumers is well documented by 3 Turkish literary texts from the 15th, 16th centuries. A short pamphlet written in Eastern Turkish, or Chagatai, sometime in the first half of the 15th century, bears witness to the rising popularity of cannabis. Yusuf Amiri's Bangu Chagir, Cannabis and Wine, describes a fictitious debate between the two intoxicating substances. Both wine and cannabis tries to establish his supremacy over his worded argumentation, supplemented with poetic quotations. Nevertheless, the debate ends in a draw, which suggests that perhaps due to its availability, cheapness, and most importantly, its halal or legally allowed status, cannabis was as popular as wine in the early Timurid period. Its legal status helps cannabis win the fight against wine in a recently discovered Anatolian Turkish poem, possibly from the 15th century. The story of the debate and fight between Esrar and Suji by an unknown poet in the form of a more than 100 couplets long qasida titled Esrarname. The narrative starts with the description of a spring landscape where 2 groups are having a feast each. The leaders of the 2 groups start quarreling, each of them trying to establish his supremacy over the other. Their debate is very simple. Both of them boast about his good qualities and sneers at his opponent's weaknesses. When wine runs out of arguments, he commands his companions, all of them alcoholic beverages, arak, which is liquor, boza, which is a fermented beverage usually made from millet, to attack and beat up his rival. In the ensuing fight, Esrar is helped by Afyon, opium, Karapehlavan, which was an Ottoman designer drug containing opium, Majun, a designer drug paste with varying ingredients, and Hab, pill. The 2 parties are more or less equal in strength, and neither can subdue the other. So Esrar, or cannabis, suggests that they should go to a judge and ask him to deliver justice. As soon as wine refuses to see a qadi, religious judge, and to obey religious law, Esrar overcomes him and wins the fight. Muhammad Fuzuli, whose poem I've already mentioned, Muhammad Fuzuli's version of the dispute ends in the opposite way, with the victory of wine. According to a now generally accepted view, Fuzuli's Bengubade is an allegorical work dedicated to the Safavid ruler Shah Ismail, who is represented by the character of wine in the story, while the other hero, Vid, would stand for his political opponent, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II. Nevertheless, a miniature painting, you can see on the picture, in the Dresden manuscript of the text dated 1600, the manuscript is dated 1600, suggests that contemporary readers might have interpreted the text as a controversy between the material and the spiritual world. The painting depicts two groups of people, a party of well-to-do nobles having a feast, here in the upper part of the image. So they are having a feast, drinking wine and listening to music, and a group of dervishes, most of whom seem to belong to various antinomian communities. Some of them are naked, as you can see. The two groups are separated by a solid stone wall, symbolizing perhaps that the two halves of this dichotomous universe, attachment to this worldly matters and real spirituality aiming at the personal experience of God, can never come to terms with each other. As I've mentioned earlier, in the first half of the 16th century, we witnessed the appearance of a new semantic field, special and unique to the Ottoman literary tradition, the semantic field of Esrar, or the semantic field of cannabis. We cannot exactly tell when it became established or who was the first poet who realized the poetic potential inherent in the double meaning of the words Esrar and Hayran, which originally means amazement, and which is the par excellence term denoting cannabis intoxication. Possibly the first textual hint at an already well-established and strong semantic bond between the words Esrar and Hayran, and also at the existence of the semantic field of cannabis in classical poetry, comes from a ghazal by Ahi, who passed away in 1517. In one of his couplets, in one of his baits, Esrar occurs in a tanasub, a trope based on semantically related words, together with three other elements of the semantic field. Hayran, Kaifiyat, a blissed state occasioned by the consumption of cannabis, and Majunji, a person whose job is to prepare various types of drugs. And here you can see the bait. Halk hayrandur benim keyfiyeti esrarıma, ben şu macunci güzel esrarına hayraniyam. So people are dumbfounded by the secret that caused my happy state of mind. I'm intoxicated by the cannabis made by this beautiful Majunji. And these words set in bold, like Hayran, Kayfiyat, Esrar, Majunji, and Hayran again, and Esrar, are part of this special semantic field of cannabis. The semantic field of cannabis in its fully developed form consisted of two subfields, the subfield of dervish life and the subfield of lay society's cannabis consumption. The subfield of lay society's cannabis use might be best illustrated with a short ghazal composed by Muini, describing the shop of a, the shop of a Majunji, or a person who prepares drugs in Istanbul. Just I translate you the first few lines. So, gözüm tuş oldu, eylerken İstanbul içre seyrani, açılmış zineti ile bir güzel macuncu dükkanı. Oturmuş anda bir hokkadehen yar müferrihleb, ki bir keyfiyet ile hokkaya koymuş içeceğini. While I was strolling in Istanbul, my eye fell on a newly opened and beautiful shop of a nice macun maker. A beloved setting there, his mouth was tiny like a pillbox. His lips were exhilarating. The euphoria he induced had already bound several souls to his pillbox, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Let's see the last couplet. Muini açılır gönlün gözün, bir habbe gam kalmaz. Yayıp macun u berşini temaşa eylesin anı. Muini, it will open up the eyes of your soul and not a single grain of sorrow remains. When you consume his macun I've also mentioned as a kind of drug paste made of opium or cannabis, and bersh, and keep looking at him. All the words set in bold belong to the semantic field of cannabis. Muini mentions two drugs in the last line of his poem Macun and bersh. So the first one, Macun, belongs to the semantic field of cannabis, but what can the other drug be? And exploring what bersh can be, I'll start this with a quotation from Evliya Çelebi's travelogue. Quote, "One day during their conversation, a gaunt and feeble old man appeared at the door, braced by his servants. They all stood up to greet him, crying, 'Welcome, my dear Halimi Effendi,' and they sat him in the upper row. After some rounds of bersh-i rahiki and glorious coffee, as the party warmed up, they cocked their caps and began crying, 'Bre, bre.' They urged Halimi Effendi to regale them with his adventures in the company of Shehzade Selim when they went out incognito from Trabzon and spied on Shah Ismail and co." Evliya Çelebi's description of a meeting of veterans at his father's home suggests that the substance he calls bersh-i rahiki was a customary item offered to guests at parties in the 17th century Istanbul. Abdi's Surname, relating the events of state festivities that took place in 1675, illustrates it very well that by the second half of the 17th century, the use of this substance had become widespread in the city. According to Abdi, the show provided by opium addicts, Tiryakiyan, and the consumers of bersh-i rahiki, whom he calls bershharan, was a popular event of the program. A mock coffee house was set up for them where they were served coffee, opium, and bersh-i rahiki. When they started getting under the influence of these substances, fireworks were unleashed, and the Sultan laughed at the funny movements of the scared addicts. The place it occupied in everyday life in the 16th, 17th centuries lent the substance so much poetic potential that bersh-i rahiki made its appearance in contemporary classical poetry as well. The late 17th century poet Siyahi Dede's qasida, dedicated to Mahmud Effendi, praised the then Defterdar of Cyprus for his generosity and munificence with the following words: "Tab ehline şeker yedirir müflise dinar, dil teşnelere su yerine cami keyane. Keyf ehli olan zümre-i erbab-i safaya etmekde durur bersh-i rahik ile i'ane." He distributes sugar to the poets and golden coin to the poor. Instead of water, he gives royal goblets to those whose heart suffers from thirst. He supports the merry ones addicted to mind-altering substances by providing them continuously with bersh-i rahik. Ahmed Yari, an Ottoman official cum poet who served at various places in the 17th century, claimed in one of his couplets that the best cure for a headache was a bersh-i rahiki. Defi suda a bersh-i rahiki shafikdur, defi humara chare rahiki atikdur. The most gentle medicine against a headache is bersh-i rahiki. The best solution against a hangover is red wine. Bersh was not only a simple substance enlivening parties or an everyday medicine against headache, it also seems to have been a source of inspiration for poets, as Nazir Ibrahim's following couplet shows. Karavetle görüp ruhsarını hayrette kalmışken Naziraya, he saw his or her face full of youthful freshness and he became intoxicated. And Bersh prompted Nazir to compose this new piece of poem today. What was this evidently very popular and socially accepted substance, which could make people talkative or groggy, but at the same time inspired poets or cured headaches, and which was expensive enough to be used as a symbol of lavishness? What was it made of? When was it first concocted? And why was it called Bershi Rahiki? The present, now I'm going to try to give an answer to all these questions. Hafiz Hussain Ayvan Sarai, who passed away in 1787, in his Majmu'a Tawarikh, a collection of chronograms compiled not long before the author's death in 1786, remarks that Bersh made its appearance in the reign of Suleiman the Lawgiver, and adds that it was invented by Yusuf Rahiki Effendi, who is often mentioned in contemporary poetic anthologies, and who prepared it first as a medicine for the Sultan. Sources from the second half of the 15th, first half of the 16th century partly confirm and partly contradict Ayvan Sarai's information. As a letter written by Mehmed the Conqueror to Fenerizade Ahmed, the tutor of his son Bayezid, who later became Bayezid II, shows that Bersh was one of the many intoxicating substances used by the prince and his boon companions. And now I will read out only the English translation. Quote, "Through their wicked influence and other special methods, they changed my son's nature. They enticed him with secrets, Esrar, that caused carelessness, and his noble memory became covered with the dust of bewilderment. They brought unknown electuaries, bersh, and strange intoxicants prepared from opium, claiming that these are very pleasant, useful, extremely enjoyable, and helpful. They made him lose his humanity, and they broke his noble character." End quote. The Sultan's letter, dated 1479, is important from 2 points of view. First, it suggests that a substance called bersh existed before Rahiki's time, who, according to Ayvan Sarai, passed away in 1547. And second, it also informs us that bersh was used as a kind of mind-altering drug, belonging to the same class, mukayyifat, as opium or electuary paste majun. Bersh thus appears to have been the name of a drug which was clearly not invented by Rahiki, as Ayvan Sarai states. Still, in a way, his assertion might be correct if we suppose that Bershi Rahiki was a special type of bersh designed by Rahiki, who modified some original recipe. Mustafa Ali, one of the great intellectuals of the second half of the 16th century. So Mustafa Ali's information seems to confirm this theory, since he claims, quote, that one of the sheikhs who were close to him saw his poverty, Rahiki's poverty, and misery, took pity on him and gifted him with the recipe of Filonya-i Salimi. He increased the quantity of some of the ingredients and decreased the quantity of others, end quote. As far as Rahiki's person is concerned, Ayvan Sarai is right to state that the best sources for his life are contemporary poetic anthologies, tezkeres, as all of them, except for Ahdi's work, devote at least a few lines to his life and poetry. Sehi Bey, who passed away in 1548 and who is the author of the first such poetic anthology, described Rahiki, whose original name according to him was Yusuf, as a person of melancholic character, a druggist by profession, was extremely talented in concocting medicines. Latifi, quite evidently not being a fan of Rahiki's poetic output, didn't waste much space on him. Ashik Chalabi, who met him in person, informs his readers very briefly in his short entry on Rahiki that his original name was Sinan. He used to be a Kulolo, very much interested in both rational and Gnostic knowledge, but after the Mustafa Agha incident, his Ulufe payment was cancelled and he was forced to look for another way of living. Rahiki's ordeal soon turned out to be a lucky turn in his life. He opened a druggist shop at the Mahmud Pasha market and learned his new profession by studying medical books. Soon enough, he added wine to his range of products and his shop started flourishing. Quote, people well-versed in Gnostic knowledge, Erbabi Irfan, planning to go for a stroll to Galata, and beloveds wishing to fascinate their lovers with their beauty all flocked to his shop. And for these lively people, he prepared everything that was needed for a good party. End quote. Rahiki's business prospered, and soon he became a well-to-do man. His success might have been partly due to his ability to tap into the current trends in contemporary drug culture. Bersh at that time appears to have been so popular with educated people that, as a short poem, a Kit'a by Yatim indicates, the image of the light-minded scribes became closely associated with the notion of Bersh consumption in the mid-16th century Ottoman public opinion. The English translation of this poem is, they are food for only light-minded people. See the proof, Bersh and opium are despised by most people. The Chalabis, the scribes, however, are craving for them. In a 17th century prose text relating a debate between pleasure-giving substances, opium, Bershi Rahiki, cannabis, boza, wine, and coffee, Bersh intends to prove his superiority by saying that he is favored by witty and gentle Chalabis who are in the possession of total perfection, beloveds whose nature is full of coquetry and whose behavior makes people agitated, servants initiated into Gnostic knowledge and gifted with poetic talent, and famous scholars. Contemporary historical sources also quite often refer to the Bersh addiction of people belonging to this layer of society. In his Nasihat al-Salatin, Mustafa Ali complains more than once about the incapability of scribes to do their work properly due to their addiction to Bersh and other drugs. His remark on the bad habits of calligraphers illustrates well how widespread and common the addiction to the drug was among the intelligentsia. Quote, in short, calligraphy is a virtue which unstintingly confers honor upon those who possess it, and the art of writing is a path toward nobility and fame which leads those who command it to glory and high station, unless they are reproached by people for bad morals or are notorious for their addiction to Bersh, Afyon, and Bang. End quote. The drug habits of certain social groups was surely influenced by their financial capabilities. Dervishes and the poor preferred cannabis, a mind-altering substance that was relatively cheap and easily accessible since it was made from a plant growing also wine, and in its crudest form as esrar or gubar, its preparation didn't need any professional expertise. Bersh, on the other hand, was produced by specialists like Rahiki, which quite necessarily meant that it was more costly and available for only those who could afford a higher price. Now we come to the question of ingredients. Contemporary sources occasionally refer to the short or long-term effects of Bersh, but they do not mention what Rahiki's pill was made of. The sole exception is a medical text, the Majma-i-Tib, written by Siyahi Karamani Larendevi in the late 16th, early 17th century, seems to have preserved the whole recipe. The two main psychoactive components in the mixture were opium and the ground seeds of white henbane, Hyoscyamus albus. The other ingredients included black pepper, ginger, saffron, yellow sweet clover, Melilotus officinalis, Spanish chamomile, cardamom, cinnamon, Arabian balsam tree, castoreum, resin spurge, Indian valerian, celery seeds, and last but not least, honey. First, the henbane seeds were heated up, and then they were soaked in water for 3 days. Each day, the water was changed 3 times. After carefully drying the seeds in the shade, they were ground together with the other ingredients except for saffron and mixed with almond oil. The mixture was left to rest overnight. Next day, honey was heated up, and when it cooled down, first saffron was added, then all the other components. Finally, small pills were formed from the soft paste. Compared to other preparations having a similar name, the Bersa Isha of the 15th century pharmacological works, the Bersi Filuniai Rumi, as found in the Halvahana Defteri, Bersh from late 16th century Egypt, and Bersh as prepared in 19th century Iran, it's quite obvious that Mustafa Ali's information on Rahikis modifying the recipe of an already existing drug might be correct, since Rahiki's mixture was based on the same psychoactive components, opium and henbane, as other electuaries of the Bersh type, and it differed only in its flavoring. Evliya Çelebi's description of the old veterans having coffee and Bersh would suggest that this designer drug was a rather harmless confectionery. However, it was not the case, as the long-term use of Bersh could lead to physical decline and ultimately to death. Contemporary poetical anthologies contain many stories of poets whose death was caused by Bersh. Beyani's fate, as described by Aşık Çelebi, seems to have been a typical end for an addict. Quote, before he died, Bersh had withered him to such an extent that everyone who saw him thought that instead of poisonous opium, he had been consuming lethal venom. He got absorbed into the secrets of pleasures, and plunged into the world of weird visions so deeply that he became like an apparition himself. His body was like a twig, his shape like a waning moon, and weakness made him like a toothpick. End quote. Besides long-term health effects, consumers of Bersh also had to face the risk of getting killed by a not properly prepared substance. Aşık Çelebi recorded a tragic event that took place in Galata in the house of the painter Haydar in 1563, when the pills offered by the host killed one of the guests and made seriously sick several others. There was a gathering in the house of the above-mentioned Nigari. When it was suggested that it was high time for parting, a medicine box was brought in. Out of those who took pills from it, Sinan Çelebi, the judge of Eyüp, died on the spot. Others became seriously sick, deadly ill, or went delirious. Everyone talked about this misfortune, and some witty people composed a chronogram recording its date. The chronogram of the misfortune of the Bersh eaters is the following: those who ate the Bersh of Haydar all passed away. End quote. Nevertheless, people appear not to have been bothered by health hazards, and the spread of coffee drinking made Bersh even more popular. Taking Bersh with a cup of coffee had become a quite common custom and an integral part of friendly gatherings in the 1560s. Semiz Ali Pasha, the Grand Vizier, made fun of the two commanders of the Ottoman fleet sailing towards Malta in 1562, saying, that, quote, the aforementioned persons are ill-famed for being addicted to intoxication. We have sent 2 people who are prone to get intoxicated for an excursion to the islands. Their ships must be full of bersh and coffee. I do not know what services they will render, but I'm sure they will have a good time consuming bersh and coffee, end quote. The custom soon spread to other parts of the empire. The inventory, Muhallefa Defteri, of the bequest of an Ottoman gentleman who passed away in Buda in Hungary sometime around 1587, included several items of bersh. And William Biddulph, an English clergyman, observed in Aleppo in the early 17th century that, quote, it is accounted a great courtesy amongst them to give unto their friends when they come to visit them a finjan or scudella of coffee, which is more wholesome than toothsome, for it causeth good concoction and driveth away drowsiness. Some of them will also drink bersh or opium, which maketh forget themselves and talk idle castles in the air, as though they saw visions and heard revelations, end quote. The ever-growing popularity of bersh brought enormous financial success to the undertaking Raheki founded. The demand for the drug paste and bersh designed by him seems to have been continuously increasing, and in 1591, Mustafa Ali recorded that approximately, quote, approximately 30 young boys and slaves ground the ingredients and cooked the paste in huge cauldrons, but still they were unable to meet the demands of those who craved for its pleasures. They are said to sell paste worth of 3,000 akçes after paying taxes every day. Rahieki's legacy proved to be a lasting one. His small workshop was closed down only in the early 1830s, and until 1783, when the last of his direct descendants passed away, it provided his heirs with a steady income. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your talk, Benedek. I think that was absolutely fascinating. I've been taking notes and notes and notes, but I'm not going to use speaker's privilege and hog your time. Does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Wave at me, raise your hand, speak, or forever hold your peace. Any questions?
While you are thinking, I just come forward with my theory concerning bersh and coffee. I'm sure you know this Turkish custom of drinking coffee. So when you drink coffee in Turkey, you order a cup of coffee in Turkey, you are also given a piece of lokum.
Yes.
So what I think is that originally it was not lokum. Originally it was bersh.
Okay.
But since this type of drugs are illegal now, so they switched over to some sweetmeats instead of giving drugs.
Yeah, you see, my thought on it was, because I'm just starting to do a bit of research into sort of Turkish and Islamic coffee culture and coffee and sort of the coffee house institution. But I'd always considered it as being something of balancing the flavors, the palate, because you have the black bitter coffee with something quite sweet. That had always been an idea I had, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, because bersh became, we have quite a few pieces of data confirming this theory, saying that bersh became really popular when the custom of drinking coffee spread in the Ottoman Empire. So they were popular together.
Okay, so they came around the same time. That's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure we all know you go to the shisha bars and things in modern day sort of Turkey and various places. So no, that was really interesting, because I did want to ask sort of about, I was rather interested in when you talked about sort of the legal status, and particularly in the sacred context, and the fact that it had this connection to dervishes, because that was something I had quite often heard about coffee, that the idea was it kept them awake to study and to meditate and things like that. And I was just wondering if any of the negative feelings about, you know, either coffee or the cannabis or something were maybe biased because of this connection to Sufism and dervishes, because I know they were often sort of in and out of favor.
Yeah, actually, the custom of coffee drinking spread in the empire towards the end of the 16th century. So coffee was brought to Istanbul by Sultan Selim I from his campaign in the West, and Sufi brotherhoods spread much earlier. So I'm sure they used something else for inspiration, and but you have to make a difference, or there's a huge difference between various groups we would all term Sufis, like the Mevlevis, who belong to the Orthodox, let's say, to the Orthodox brotherhoods, compared to Torlaks or Ishiks or Abdals, for example. Today's in modern Turkish, you have the word aptal, which means stupid or foolish.
Yeah. No,
and it comes from the name of a Kalandari spiritual group, Abdal.
I'd say I am, because I'm most familiar with doing my thesis on Yenicheri. I mostly know about the Bektashi. But okay, I have a question in the chat from Lynette, and then a question from Ian. So we'll take Lynette's question and then I'll hop to Ian. So Lynette asks, when did Birch become illegal when given with coffee?
When it became legal?
No, when it became illegal when given with coffee. Do we know when that was?
No.
No.
I'm sorry.
That's
I have
okay.
no information on that. But I think it's quite a modern thing.
Okay, Ian?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent talk, Benedict. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
There's one thing I have to ask about tobacco. So I'm thinking about, obviously, the waves of prohibition and disapproval that swept the Ottoman Empire, especially in the sort of middle 17th century under Murat and Vani Mehmet Efendi. So all of these things. So we talked about Berj, fascinating to hear what we think it was, and opium and cannabis, and then tobacco. So just thinking of the level of official disapproval. Now, clearly, rich intellectuals, poet types, they're taking these drugs. That must be something universal. But where does tobacco stand in all this? Obviously, people sipping coffee and having a pipe is more of the image we have, I think, of this period than of people taking what we think of now as really illegal hard drugs. Tobacco is obviously not illegal, although I'm sure it's just as harmful as some of the things we'll be talking about. So where do you put tobacco into all this, Benedict?
In an Ottoman context, you mean?
Yes.
I have to admit I'm not an Ottomanist. I do research on literary topics. So, and what I think is that tobacco spread quite late because it's coming from the New World. And I mean, earlier, I don't know any example of smoking something or of some herbs. So smoking tobacco must have been something new. And actually, I can't answer your question.
No, that's okay.
I'm afraid.
But I think I can hop in on Ian's question about tobacco. Not that I haven't done a dedicated study of tobacco, but I would concur with Benedict from what I know, with it being a later innovation, because there is a book I was I was working on a 19th century Bulgarian novel for a conference paper, and I looked at there's a book called Balkan Smoke, I think it is, and it talks about tobacco, and specifically tobacco in the coffee house, and sort of how it became a sort of a cultural thing. And I say that was focusing on sort of 19th century, and there was a lot of talk about rite of passage and coming to manhood and things like that. But yes, I do think it was later, because all of my knowledge of tobacco is sort of 19th century onwards. So, but I would recommend looking up that book Balkan Smoke by Mary Nürnberger, I think she's called. I would have to double check that. But yes, if you're interested in tobacco and when it came to the Ottoman Empire, that's just a reference I can give you.
What I know of tobacco smoking is that archaeological excavations in Hungary on sites related to the period of Ottoman occupation of Hungary. Instruments or tools for smoking are from the 17th century, second half of the 17th century, not earlier. So it's a quite late custom in the Ottoman Empire.
But there's no guarantee on those archaeological sites. I mean, could we, to be sure exactly what they were smoking, whether it was tobacco or it was one of the drugs you've discussed. There's no sort of clear answer for that, is there?
No, actually, drugs were not smoked.
Okay.
It's quite a late custom to smoke cannabis.
Okay.
Cannabis was cooked either in water or in milk.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Just scrolling through. Most people don't have a camera on, but any questions, drop them in the chat. Come and wave at me. Otherwise, Craig, do you have questions?
No, thank you.
No, nothing from you. Okay. Well, in that case, I think very few questions clearly means you've covered the topic so thoroughly that there's no questions left unanswered. You've given us a very comprehensive rundown. I very much enjoyed it. I'm pretty sure everyone else did as well. So if you hang on, Ian's got a hand up again, or is that an applause? Yes, I was just going to say, if you would care to possibly unmute your microphones, we'll give our speaker a round of applause. Everyone? Yay!
Thank you so much. You are really generous and very kind.
Well,
if you allow me to add something, I have written several articles on the topic in English, and you can find these articles on my academia page. I've written articles on the semantic field of cannabis, or the Rahaki story is quite interesting, how he became a druggist. So if you are interested in these things, then you can read my articles.
Yeah, and academia is very good. I'm sure everyone knows it, but yes, open access. So it's very generous of you to make your work available on that platform. And hopefully this won't be the last time we get to hear from you, Benedek. Let's stay in touch, and we'll be very interested to see where your work goes in the future.
Thank you so much.
So thank you for coming, everyone. I now release you to do whatever you desire with your evening. And hopefully we will meet again, or we'll see each other again another talk in the near future. So thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Bye bye.